Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, which is hosted by Greenleaf Publishing. This session, which coincides with the first World Values Day, will be presented by Ed Mayo. Ed is Secretary General at Co-operatives UK, which develops and promotes member-owned enterprise. He's also co-author of Cooperative Advantage and a number of other titles covering marketing, banking and microfinance. In today's webcast, Ed will be discussing the topics covered in his latest book, Values, How to Bring Values to Life in Your Business. This is an interactive session, so please feel free to send through any questions for Ed using the chat box on the left of your screen. And finally, everyone who's registered for this event will receive a free e-copy of Ed's latest book, which we'll email out to you later this afternoon. Okay, so over to you, Ed.
Welcome to everybody on this webinar. Daniel described it as my latest book. Well, I'm not a prolific author, but this book, as I was writing it, told something of the story for myself over the last 30 years of working with ethical business, from being part of the team that started the Fair Trademark, which went kind of worldwide, through an involvement in social investment, and currently in profit with purpose business, cooperatives. So we're going to go through this, and as Daniel said, there will be space and time for questions. So if you want to try and play with the chat box, then you are very welcome. We're going to start with a well-known figure, Nelson Mandela. What are the values that Nelson Mandela has? And one way into that, and we all may have a view, is his words, inspiring and often cited words at the Rivonia trial that sent him to jail. And there he says, during my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. There is a recording you can find of that speech online, and it's ever so moving compared to so many videos and recordings that are intended to go up on YouTube, where the quality is pretty good, and I hope the quality is good for you today. Actually, you just get the sense of a microphone across the courtroom, picking up the quiet dignity of the words he speaks, not knowing if there's a death sentence to come from the judge. And I use that text, and it's also used by a business coach, Victoria, who shared it with me as an example of way into values. And Nelson Mandela in this speech names 4 values that he holds that we can pick out: democracy, freedom, harmony, and equality. And in this webinar, I hope to explain a little bit more of what values are, why they are important in shaping behaviour, not just at a personal level, but shaping behaviour within organisations. And I'm focusing within this on business, which is the area that I work. But in truth, values will unite and be relevant to many or all organisations. So by the end of the webinar, I hope to leave you with a good sense of what values are, for sure, to have told you some stories of how values play out in business. Some of them positive, some of them cautionary. There's a fair few pitfalls to watch when we're dealing with values and culture in business as well. So this is what the structure that I've got for our session. We're starting off, as I say, about values themselves. We'll stop there for any questions that are sent through. And if you do ask a question, feel free to send it through at any time. But I'll probably wait until we get to that section before picking them up. I'm conscious as well that I have colleagues and friends listening into this, including people that have fed into the book and inspired the book. My work on this has been very much a conversation with friends and colleagues in a wide range of settings. And in the classic term, authors are always supposed to say, well, the mistakes are mine. I can't pass the mistakes off to anybody else. But the responsibility is shared. I'm then going to look through a number of case studies before looking at, and in particular, cooperatives, member-owned businesses, as a test case of values in action. There are millions of cooperatives around the world sharing a global set of values. And nicely, today is World Values Day, the first of its kind. It's also a Banking on Values Day, which isn't as much a coincidence as you might think. And I know you might think, well, there's a day for everything. But there's a constituency of banks that are focusing on values, partly in response to the crisis and scandals of the credit crunch, and they've joined in this what it should be a very special day. And thank you for being part of it. Again, we've got a session for questions, and then I go on to the practical tools around values, which is really making these things work. The challenge is always, and it was for the intro to this webinar, whether values are just the poster on the wall, or whether they can be more. How do you bring them into action? I think working with values can be difficult. So practical tools are what we need, and I hope to go through some of those in the session that we've got today, and there will be more in the book itself. So to start with, this is my Oxford English Dictionary, which was given to me by my granny, and I've gone through, you'll see a pencil mark under value there, which I'm not sure my granny would have approved of. My granny gave me lots of advice about how to live, what she thought was important. She always told me to cut my nails, otherwise I'd never get a girl. I better not comment on how that quite kind of played out. She also gave me advice about flexibility. She said, Edward, she said, if you can't ride two horses, you shouldn't be in the circus. And it's always been my view that however passionately you believe in your own values, however passionately you believe in the great causes of our time, which is people's development, the move to a more ecologically sustainable way of life, model for the earth as a whole, you have to listen to the values of others and engage with them in the process. And the Oxford English Dictionary definition is that values, there are different, it gives you different definitions. This is the one that we're focusing on. Are principles or standards of behaviour, the judgment about what's important in life. So values are what drive our motivation. They're about what we care about. It's worth just clarifying that values are not only ethics. Ethical values, fairness, kindness, compassion, many of the values that are taught by the great faiths are values, but there are other values as well. If values are what motivate us, then we will see other values come into play, and I'll give some examples of those, but they may be about greed, status, personal advancement. These are values as well. So I think ethics and ethical values are a subset of values, but they have a particular magic. And when we come to look at shared values, when organizations start to think about what values they choose to hold, it can be a very liberating, it can be a very progressive process that tends to lean towards the ethical values simply because those values are more universal. They have a claim on all of us. Now, what makes us act? And I'd like you to imagine in this webinar that you have woken up one morning as a donkey, and the donkey is where the story of the carrot and the stick come from. It's not something that's in every culture or every language in the world, but it's an idea that you can motivate people to act by giving them a positive incentive. For a donkey, that's definitely a carrot. If you're a donkey and you've thought your way into it, now that carrot looks very tasty. Or a stick, and again, if you are into the donkey mindset, and please don't go too far, then as thick a hide as you have, that stick is painful. So pain or gain are the classic ways in which we know how to make people act. But there is another view, and it's a view that's emerged strongly in the theories of self-determination, psychological theories around self-determination, which is that the carrot and the stick are outside of us. They are how we see ourselves in relation to what is going on outside. They are, in this case, imposed by somebody else, the person wanting the donkey to move. But there is a different motivation, which I call the rose, which is those values, those things that we care deeply about already, those things that we care about inside of us. These are intrinsic motivations. So I use the rose as an image of beauty, something that that is of value in itself, as a way to look at what makes us act. Now let's just take this in relation to values a little more deeply, with a distinction that I learned from Tom Crompton, who runs the Common Cause Foundation, which is a wonderful organisation and initiative to try and reintroduce values, in particular in the context of some of the environmental challenges that we face, and in a world of consumer language and markets. Tom and his team invite those who are working on environmental issues to talk about the things that people do care about as intrinsic motivations, rather than the carrot and stick of money off all benefits. And this image, and I should say, I'm proud to say one of my values is family, another one is mutuality. But with my value of family and concern, I'm very pleased to say that these illustrations are all done by my son, Frankie, who is studying renewable energy in Cornwall, on the tip of England. But he has an ability to draw as well. And here, with one head, you see the intrinsic values, including ethical values that are within dignity, curiosity, empathy. And then in the other, you see the extrinsic values, ones of wealth or power or social status. And one of the lessons I've found in terms of working on values in business is not to assume that when things go wrong in a business, it's because they're not informed by values, that it may just be the wrong values. But even so, values are where you have to start. And these issues of values also do challenge us. It's very hard, given the rocketing levels of chief executive and senior executive pay, really for a chief executive to stand up and say, well, we really care about our people. There's a dignity coming here to work. And dignity is why so many of us do work. It's what people look for. If actually the dignity in their own context is measured by the size of their paycheck and whether they're 100 or 200 times the size of the take-home pay of staff that are working elsewhere in the business. There is, as one organisational sociologist describes, a kind of feigned solidarity in modern business life, and they don't sit easy. Those structures of power and status in large businesses don't sit easily with values. But that's what their values are there. Values are there to challenge us. They're not there to make things easy. And while it's often easier to think about how values might play out in a smaller business setting or a social enterprise, actually it's values at scale in larger businesses that is also important for us to look at, and is the focus as well in this book. A little bit more on values, and we're still in the early stage of understanding what the role of values are before we start to focus on organisations. Values evolved. This is told beautifully in the work of Professor Joshua Green. He writes a book on moral tribes. He's a professor of moral cognition, which is one of these sort of new disciplines that technology enables, where he focuses on our moral choices, our use of values, but uses games theory, practical games, technology and computing, brain science as well, scanning the brain to see what's quite going on when we make judgments. And Professor Green says, he puts it nicely here, out of the evolutionary dirt grows the flower of human goodness. It's not quite the selfish gene, although Richard Dawkins did change his mind on that. He regretted that title. In fact, in a later version, he said if he retitled it, he'd call it Nice Guys Finish First, because he can see and does see the role of cooperation, even if it's cooperation within a species for genetic advantage. But Joshua Green here is talking about the role of values in supporting group cooperation, so that over time, those who are willing to act out of the interests of the group and cooperate with others would see an advantage in terms of what their group does. And there's some fabulous work in the field of evolutionary biology which looks at this very subject, which I won't go on about. At the same time, of course, values is not just about groups working together. It can also be about groups in conflict, groups fighting each other. And I'm sure if you're aware of situations of conflict in organisations, you'll know that the advice for conciliators, arbitrators, intermediaries, peacekeepers is to try and understand the roots of where people are coming from, because simple disputes may be locked up in different frames of values, and therefore it's the frame that you need to go to really to be able to see how to chart a way forward. So how do values in that wider sense of personal motivation in terms of group cooperation play out within organisations? And this is something of a frame that I'm going to use in giving you some of the stories, the case studies that we're going to come on to. You're going to hear about a fair trade company. You're going to hear about a global bank that got into an ethical crisis and turned to values and failed. And then you're going to hear about a fast-moving telecoms company as well as a worker cooperative built on the values of equality. So those are some of the stories that we will tell. So I'm going to come back to this slide and invite you now to think about your own values. And this is something not always easy to do. And if you just focus on values in an abstract way, then you end up only really connecting with those people who are good at abstract thinking. Here are some of the values, just as a way into this, that are put up in a sparkling little video for World Values Day. And it is an array of different values that you may have. And the World Values Day team, and today is World Values Day, as I said, had us put up our values online. I have no idea the numbers that have fed into this. This was probably quite early on when I took this slide. It may have changed. Watch this space. Respect, love, truth coming out with the different values that people may have. Also gone around talking to people about the different values that they may care about. Fun, freedom. I was tweeted this morning a picture of the Italian cooperative research professor Gianluca Salvatore, who is one of the most brainy people I have ever met, and I asked him about his values. And as an Italian, I wondered what we were going to get, whether it was going to be food or family or cooperation. They're notoriously cooperative, the Italians. And he came up with collective innovation. So I don't think that was on the list of world values, but what's important to you and what's important to matter. Way into that. I told you a little bit about my values, and just to tell you only briefly about my own story, which has been a story of working in values-based organizations, values-based business over time. When I left university, I was involved in a team of people that had a crazy idea. We were inspired by a quality mark invented by Australian sheep farmers called Woolmark. And Woolmark you could find on any good woolen product, jumpers or others. And we had the idea of doing for international justice, world development, what Woolmark had done for wool. And the model that we came up with was the Fair Trade mark. I later then went to the New Economics Foundation, which I worked at there from 1992 to 2003, and we worked on almost every aspect of ethical business and ethical markets. We developed a model called social auditing, and I'll tell you a little bit of the story of that in the first case study, but as well ethical investment field and others. And my colleague there, Simon Zadek, who I owe a huge debt to, developed a program that we got backing from the Paul Hamlin Foundation called Values-Based Organisation, where we were looking at how large organisations as they scale could remain true to their values. And I think it's probably fair to say that some of the triple bottom line accounting that we see in business today stems from that, in part from that original program. And today, as Daniel mentioned, I work at Co-operatives UK, so I support cooperatives. This webinar comes from Ipswich. I'm in the beautiful headquarters, Worsted Park, of the East of England Cooperative Society, and I've been with 200 store managers this morning, talking about their values. For them it's we care, we grow, and we can do. And they're talking about the little things that they can do. So they run food shops, convenience stores. And one of the things that the society has done is to champion dementia-friendly practices. So training staff to be dementia aware of customers or others are suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, or other conditions, so that they can support them and recognise them. And it's been a very inspiring initiative. The mayor of Ipswich, where I am now, has taken it up. He's said that he wants Ipswich to be a dementia-friendly town. And therefore, the East of England Co-op, who's been generously training other businesses in town and other community groups, has now working with the Ipswich Town Football Club, famously known as the Tractor Boys, to bring those values into play more widely within the town. A little bit about me. Now, I'm going to move on to the case studies in a minute, but if there are any questions that you have about the nature of values that you'd like to raise, please feel free to send those on the chat box. Danielle, at the moment I don't have any that's coming through to me. Is there any that you've picked up?
Well, I was just wondering, Ed, about when you talk about the nature of values, how we deal maybe with conflicting values, like, you know, within an organisation, if, you know, who decides what is a good value and what is how you feel if your values conflict with those of others. How would you address that?
We'll come on to some of that in the case studies, but you're right to say that there will always be conflicting values because people bring their own personal values to work. But it's also the case that when we talk about organisational values, it makes it sound more simple than it is. Because in truth, you don't want a single set of values within an organisation. Yes, you want values that are shared at the core, but you don't want your audit team to have the values of your marketing team. If your accounts, you know, have the creative flair and spin of a great promotions and marketing team, then you're getting it wrong. So there will be different values within an organisation, and those different values bring with them a kind of tension. The same is also true at board level, that board level is a fabulous level to work on values, to build values into governance and also to leadership. It can be overstated. The work of some people, the Financial Reporting Council has done some very good work on culture and governance here in the UK. But it's a slightly top-down model, the idea that you just get it at the board level or the chief exec, then that will transmit values across the organisation. Of course, that's not right. It's about that listening and starting from where people are. There's a lot you can do on the board level, but in boards, you may want to build in values, for example, into code of conduct for directors, how the board behave. But equally, you don't want groupthink within boards. You have to have honest challenge. So organisational cultures are certainly complex. And some of the case studies, Danielle, that we're going to look at, will look at how those can be adapted and developed and change over time. And so I'll start with a question before, one to you before we move on to our first case study, which is whether you can recognise this one. And this is a famous business code of ethics. I think it's 64 pages long. I think you can pick up copies probably still on eBay. I think they're worth more following the collapse of the company, Enron, than they probably ever were valued at the time. And Enron is a fascinating example. It was failed after a whistleblowing, and it's an interesting mix. It's easy to demonise companies that fail, and I wouldn't stop you doing that in relation to Enron, which let a lot of people down, including its staff and its customers. But it had many of the things going for it. The chief executive was a charismatic chief executive, the co-organizer of the World Economic Forum in Davos, the year before. But the Code of Ethics covers exactly the kinds of behaviour that actually it flagrantly broke and was subject to the whistleblowing. And this is the core of it, which is we are seeing it become the norm now, really, for most large companies, certainly most listed businesses, something like 4 out of 5, to have ethics that they will put on their website or their canteens or their annual report. It's how do you live those and bring those to life that is core. And a good example, starting from an organisation that is values rich, is the fair trade company Tradecraft. And Tradecraft, which is based out of the northeast in the UK, was founded in 1979. It's a company I'm immensely fond of because it kept my parents in recycled toilet paper for many years. But if you can imagine yourself that you found a fair trade company, your mission is love and justice in world trade. And in around 1994, so some years after you've been going and been trading, you're sitting around the table with other board directors asking, how are we doing? How are we doing against those values and that mission of love and justice in world trade? And at this point, I started working with Tradecraft and a colleague, Simon, to be able to answer that question. And the approach that we took was to go to the key stakeholders, the key partners in the business, to ask them what they thought progress was against the values that Tradecraft have, but also to bring their own values into the picture in terms of what really mattered, in terms of what Tradecraft was doing. And this was a method for what we called social audit, as I say, and is sort of fed into social accounting more widely now. The results were very interesting. It showed that some of the things that Tradecraft thought, the directors thought were important, weren't actually important to those that were affected by them. So Tradecraft was selling fair trade produce from producer groups, cooperatives typically, around the world. So when we went to speak to producer businesses in the Philippines, for example, they said, well, we're not most interested in price, which is kind of what you would expect. How much of this banana goes back to banana farmers and so on. They said, well, actually, we're more interested in market information and continuity so that we can develop and add value over time rather than just being on the end of a volatile and competitive world market. As a result of that first and then subsequent social audits, the Tradecraft Board of Directors also became clearer on what they were trying to achieve. It helped them to be sharper in terms of focusing on high performance. So out went love and justice in world trade as an overall objective, although the values which are rooted in Christianity for Tradecraft remain there and remain true. And in came a much more focused mission to fight poverty through trade, practicing and promoting approaches to trade that help poor people in developing countries transform their lives. You can read it there on screen. And that was much easier then to be able to develop the metrics to measure progress over time and to see where to put resources in line with those values. It is a company, it aims to make a profit, but it has a larger values-led purpose. So if we go back to our framework of where we have these two axes of shared values on the one hand and not shared values on the other hand, which is, Danielle, I think close to where your question was being asked. And then also on another axis of whether those values are coherent or whether they're incoherent and what might emerge from that. Tradecraft is an example of a business that has moved very much into the top right-hand quadrant, as any economist knows, is always, where you should be aiming, whether it's the sort of Boston Group, cows or others. For some reason, it just always seems to be a default of aim for the top right quadrant. And Tradecraft were able to move to that by looking not just at the values of the business and the board and those most directly involved, but the values also of the key stakeholders, customers, local groups selling Tradecraft, churches and others, and the producers as well, so that what emerged was a much more shared sense of values and of purpose itself. That's my first story, my first case study. And my second one is of a global bank. And this is the case study of Barclays. Barclays Bank has a long and international history. It dates back in the 19th century to the nonconformists. And the nonconformists were those who, for reasons of the faith and religion, were excluded from professional roles, and they went into business. So Barclays, in theory, had an ethical set of beginnings, but it had got itself into very deep trouble around the time of the credit crunch post 2007 and 8. And after the aptly named chief executive Bob Diamond was cleared out after a scandal that broke out with the bank around mis-selling, the board brought in a new chief executive, Anthony Jenkins, and he set about cleaning up the Augean stables that was the bank. He called in Anthony Saltz to do an independent review. It was a pretty expensive review, £15 million in total. And Saltz made a series of recommendations that the bank should set itself targets against. What then happened, and what we find is that it's easier to change chief executives than it is values. It's a reminder perhaps of the old saying that business doesn't have a culture, business is a culture, and therefore all the more difficult to change. But the board, after 3.5 years, moved Anthony Jenkins on. The board chair, executive chair, said we'd asked him to come in and do one job, but actually now there's a different job that we wanted to focus on. And that job was return on capital, was financial rather than ethical and about conduct. And not too long after that, we then had the Barclays involvement in the global libel scandal, subject to billion-dollar fines, and Barclays staff engaging in chat rooms, one of whom said, "If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying." So Barclays, which continues its values program, but you wouldn't give that much money on its success, was an example of a bank that has moved in the wrong direction. There was clear conflict between different parts of the banking, the retail banking and the more merchant banking side. But if anything, by bringing in a chief exec that set his stall on a shift in values, and then I'm not sure I should use the word sacking, because these things are subject to legal agreements that defy the word sacking, but then moving the chief executive on meant that Barclays ended up in pure confusion about what its values are. But there's also an interesting comment around the nature of the Saltz review, and there's a very informed commentator, Douglas Board, who described the way that Barclays has approached this as essentially setting targets to achieve changes in ethics and then managing it in a top-down way. What he says is that it was giving the bank ethical fish with sell-by dates rather than teaching the bank how to fish ethically. it focused less on the capabilities of values, and in particular, it focused less on how to work with the values of people that come in to work in the morning wanting to do a good job, not wanting to cheat in this case. And what emerged out of that in terms of culture change is that leadership on values is more about facilitation than it is direction. Now, the third story is the story of Nokia, and it is a remarkable story. I'll keep this brief, and the comments there from two strategy professors kind of says it all. Just telling the truth could have saved Nokia's functions, because Nokia in 2006 operated in 150 countries with 17,000 kind of employees. Today has got a small percentage of that, as half of its global market share that it had before for mobile phones. It's an also-ran in the smartphone market. But in 2006, it decided to look at its corporate values, to re-examine them. And the interesting thing was that it did so in what in many ways looked an exemplary way. It reached out to all of its employees, Nokians as they were known, through an online Nokia Jam. They had a participative face-to-face process, the World Cafe, under the theme of a trip to the moon. There were 16 of these events around the world in the course of 60 days, each attended by 100 employees. Video blogs, and 22,000 employees took part in an imaginative contest to choose photos that matched the values that emerged. And those that did emerge were achieving together, engaging you, passion for innovation, and very human, were approved by a global meeting of 150 top leaders of the company. So it was an exemplary process with one fatal caveat, which was that Nokia sidestepped the key cultural challenge that faced the company, which was in truth competition between the silos within the company, and as a result, a lack of focus on the external environment. In a very fast-moving competitive environment, Nokia lost out. And in fact, it's not just the strategy professors, but the CEO from 2006 2000 to 2010, Olli-Pekka Kaluspio, points to inappropriate values, a lack of truth-telling, and internal competition as key to Nokia's subsequent failure. So Nokia moved in that context, again from one side of the values towards more shared values, but not values that were coherent. And I describe this as the values fit. My ex-colleague Simon Zadek says it's very easy to romanticize values, the values that an organization started with, but those values can become archaic, that values have to be refreshed and renewed over time. So there has to be a fit of organizational values with the values in the world outside. So all of those stories talk about larger businesses, but I want to encourage you that values are absolutely part of what gets many people out of bed when they come to start or grow a business. And I've worked with the entrepreneurship expert, you wouldn't mind me calling her guru, Rebecca Harding, who was called to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, on a study she did across over a dozen countries worldwide to look at the motivations of entrepreneurs. And what she finds is that there is a significant number of entrepreneurs who have values as high on their motivations. But there are also a significant number, 1 in 4 worldwide, that are actually led by those values, ethical values, social values, or environmental values. That's core to why they are running their business. So entrepreneurship is not what you see on the apprentice program or the like. Entrepreneurship is far more human, far more complicated, and values can be a key part of all business. Just imagine if we could release and harness that entrepreneurship for values. I'm going to skip through now a number of slides around cooperatives, which operate on a global set of values, as I've mentioned, and 7 cooperative principles. We surveyed for this book cooperatives worldwide, and we found that social responsibility is the #1 value that's used, democracy is the second, and openness is the third. And Ian McPherson, who died a couple of years ago, but an inspiring facilitator of those cooperative values with a worldwide process that led to their confirmation in 1995, that dates back further. Ian puts it that the ideal will always be beyond one's grasp, and that's what creates a special kind of entrepreneurship. This is me giving an award to Cooperative of the Year to the Yorkshire-based worker cooperative, Suma Whole Foods. And that's a fascinating example of a cooperative that has grown fast, but with a commitment to equality. So for them, equality is at all levels, but is also about equal pay. Their management is elected from amongst the staff. Not all staff are member owners. It's an employee-owned cooperative business. But it's members that they're looking to recruit, people that understand the values of the business. Here's Emma on the floor. And she's talking about the work that Suma's been doing to tackle and promote gender equality, tackling not just the conscious bias, but also what Iris Burnett in recent work has focused on in terms of the unconscious biases that trip us up. So looking at images and the like. And they've recruited members. Bob Cannell from Suma says, we'd rather recruit a good person, a good member that we can then train to be an accountant, rather than recruit an accountant and then find it hard to get them to become a member. So the only job descriptions they have are the attitudes and values of someone coming in, and aptitudes of someone coming in as a member, rather than job descriptions for a forklift driver, or indeed an accountant or a digital marketer. Suma, I would say, is strongly values oriented and high on our framework to begin with. So values can in effect be like a northbound train. If everybody is connected to those, feels a sense of ownership and is going in the same direction, that's the power. Conversely, where you have conflict, and certainly conflict in cooperatives is probably worse than in other businesses where you can just tell people what to do and to get on with it, then actually you have people pulling in very different directions because they have an emotional stake and an emotional entitlement that says that they will want to argue it and fight through it. But there's been some great examples, and the East of England Co-op, where I am today, is one of the earliest businesses to be awarded the Fair Tax mark, which simply means that it pays its fair share of taxes. It's not putting money through the Cayman Islands. It pays taxes for teachers, nurses, and schools in that way. And that's a model that's been developed by Richard Murphy, Paul Monahan, and a team of others now, the Fair Tax mark, and spreading through at large utilities and other companies, FTSE 250 companies, picking it up. So innovations coming out of values. Now, before I move on to the tools section, I'm just going to open up to any questions that you may have. Danielle, have you anything from your side?
Hi Ed, this is Victoria at Greenleaf. We've had a question come through from one of the attendees, Tom Crompton. He says, hi Ed, this is fascinating. Here's what's bugging me. Publicly listed companies often use intrinsic values instrumentally. For example, to encourage customer trust and loyalty. This is fine while profits and values coincide in this way, but these two things frequently diverge. Is this tension ever going to be properly reconcilable? Can we really be sanguine about the prospects for companies to both fulfill their fiduciary duties and dependably model intrinsic values?
Well, thank you, Tom, and that's it's a fabulous question. And one of the parts that I look at in the book is about where values start and stop. And in cooperatives such as SUMA, those values are embedded into the ownership of the organisation itself. In B corporations, fast growing, again, values and public interest is embedded into the constitution, not necessarily the ownership of the company. And there's some research to show that privately owned companies, like family companies, do score higher in terms of values and operating with those values in a way of integrity than listed companies. And actually, when you move towards listing or an IPO, tends actually to be the time when you move away from those. For those with longer memories, maybe the utilities that were privatized, British Gas ended up with, I think it was, Cedric the Pig. It was this sense that you had been a public interest body, but if you're going to become a company, then you might as well have the values of a pirate, and that's, for some years, that is pretty much what they did have. So moving further up the ownership chain obviously gives you more chance to be able to operate with true integrity in relation to those values. I think also values can cause resistance. I talked about in the case of Barclays the dangers of a top-down approach, and I've seen retail companies try and almost police the emotional life of their frontline service staff by training them and conditioning them as to how they should respond in line with values, which are essentially around customer service, to those that are in front of them. And that made me very uneasy, because it wasn't really starting with what those people themselves wanted to do. It was picking them up if their face wasn't aching from a smile, or carrying through models of service that actually were quite inauthentic and artificial in that way. So it is not easy to be able to translate those through. But there are tools that can help in relation to this. And I'm going to just skip through now some of the following slides. Marie Hardy's done lots of work on values, talks about values needing to be of the right size. So you don't just talk about abstract values of service or passion is a very common kind of corporate value. Of course, that means something quite different from what passion in its etymology and origin in Christianity would mean of suffering, something that's been a little bit dumbed down over time. Bringing values to life in terms of focusing on behaviour. For example, here of a value of caring for others and what that might mean. Acting in line with values. One of the easiest ways for values to be undermined is by a leader that doesn't act in line with those values. Here in the cooperative sector, the chief executive of the co-op group, Richard Pennycook, took a pay cut, a voluntary pay cut, this last financial year, which is astonishing in a world of increasing chief executive pay, and that did a power of good for the confidence of colleagues that here was somebody walking the talk. There was a genuine alignment from top to bottom. Now, this is a tool I use in terms of boards, but I'm going to skip on to go, and this in terms of recruitment, to this, which talks to some extent about how do you find out what values are there within your business and within your company. And there's a number of tools and techniques that can be used. Some of these are described in the book. Tom, you will know the the values wheel or multiplex of Shalom Schwartz, which is the best peer-reviewed academic guide. But many of these other tools are also ways into it. And I would treat them not as the answer, but as prompts for a dialogue. Values are best worked on in a participatory way, and the real transformative power of connecting with people's motivations, I think, comes alive when you can link with people as part of a process where they're able to feed in, their comments and their input into they feel a sense of ownership about what those values may be. So let me move on now from those, just to come to the values checklist, and I'll close on this with any last questions that may have. And the book includes a set of tools. I've skipped over there, I'm afraid, a recruitment exercise, which is a fabulous one. How do you test for the values of honesty? And you can't just ask, well, when were you last honest? Or tell me a time when you were last honest. And that's something of a role play exercise about honesty. And again, in the book, I talk about some fabulous examples of people recruiting for values in the field of social care, where values matter so much, and how they go about some of that. But the checklist, and this is just the headlines, is included within the book as a set of prompts as to values within organisations, the extent to which values are understood and owned within the business. They're built into the policies that a board oversees, the staff handbooks, built into the supply chain and partnerships that kind of maybe there. Also built into stakeholder dialogue, so that it's values, in a wider setting of business. So in relation to this, there is the need to operate in both a top-down and a bottom-up kind of way. And in the book, and Stephen, thank you for your question about bottom-up methods, I focus on some of the participatory methods for bringing out values that have been developed by Marie Harder and used in a number of inspiring examples, making it easy for people to be able to connect with their own values and to work on values and to shape the values that are the shared values and the shared aspirations of those across a business. And Marie talks about the need to be able to elicit those values. You can't just do it from surveys and consultants, although those can certainly be useful. And she uses imageries and cards and other approaches that I describe in the book to begin to do that. So values top-down, leadership has a role, governance has a role, values bottom-up in terms of creating business as business could be, businesses that is truly in line with the values of those that are involved. Daniel, I'm going to pass back to you now, as we're at the end, I think, of our session, and I want to thank everybody who's participated in this. I hope you have a chance to enjoy the book. I would welcome your comments, because it's been a journey that is developed through comment and conversation. I'd be delighted to hear from you. My details are, and this is my, in Frankie's words, but a closing